Thank you, Dr. Patrick Greene and Dr. Trinca, for your most insightful and enlightening presentations. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite Dr. Alan Chong, Dr. Trinca, and Dr. Greene on stage for our Q&A session.
Thank you very much, both of you. That was a very interesting pair of presentations. I guess I would start off by a few comments because I see a lot of interesting overlaps and connections, and on the spot I'm very much impressed by this, and a few things in particular. The embracing or the difficulty of constructing a national narrative. Here in Singapore we actually have, as you've alluded to, several national museums that attempt in various ways to spin a historical narrative, whether it's based on history, here in the visual arts, although now the visual arts of Southeast Asia as well as Singapore, and a national gallery that will soon open in November, devoted to modern art, sculpture and painting before the year 1990. So there are several attempts at telling the national story here. I'd like you to comment on the Australian experience, because the embracing of First Peoples or Aboriginal art and Aboriginal culture has been contentious, to get to your point. It's been decades, if not multiple decades in the making to get to this point in Australia. So in a sense, this embracing of Aboriginal art and culture is not something that's sprung up overnight. And in the process of getting to the point that your two museums, I think, represent very admirably, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how one tells this story. Is it a single curatorial narrative? Is it a set of questions or discussion points? Is it a debate? Is it necessarily advocative? Is it an almost legalistic point of view, like here's a problem of an overlooked group that has been abused for centuries, and here is our antidote, our answer to that, which I have detected not in your institutions, but in perhaps other institutions. And what I'm really asking is there such a thing as a national narrative? Should we be opening ourselves to dialogue and discussion and contentious debate? And I suppose, I wonder what your comments might be in this regard.
Thanks very much, Alan, for that question. It's interesting, in the case of Britain, at various times, some people have said, usually politicians, why don't we have a national museum about Britain? Now, the British Museum is not a national museum about Britain, of course. And every now and again, people go down the road of trying to achieve it, and then they give up. And I'm always relieved when they give up, because the story of Britain is so multifaceted that you couldn't possibly do it all in one institution. When you take a country like Australia, you've got the long story, the 60,000 years that Matt mentioned, and you've got the short story, the 1788 onward story. Although in Victoria it's even shorter, because we're talking about 1835 there, and as a separate state, or colony as it was at the time, it's separated from New South Wales in 1851. There you've got a shorter story, but it is a distinct story. And the story which dominates Victoria is a story of gold, because the discovery of gold happened in the same year that it became a separate state. Very convenient. If you want to build all sorts of national institutions, find some gold. And people flooded into Victoria. The population shot up. People came from all over the world. They came from America, they came from China, they came from Europe. And it is a distinct story. Now, put that alongside the story of South Australia, the story of New South Wales, of Tasmania, of the Northern Territory, which itself wants to become a state now, and Queensland, you've got a whole series of stories. Now weave them together, then you've got a national story. And I think it's that tapestry approach which gives the strength, because it is not just the big museums that we represent that are telling those stories, because in that fabric, in that embroidery, are lots of threads. In Victoria, there are 700 museums. Sometimes they're museums, sometimes they're historical societies who've got a collection. Sometimes it's the Returned Servicemen's League in their hall have got a collection, but they're all stories where even the tiniest community wants to say, right, this is our story, this is where we stand in relation to the big story. And then you've got this long history. And I think that the art, the contemporary art of Aboriginal Australia, which you know an awful lot about, Matt, because you've got a fantastic collection relating to that, and is one of the steps on the journey. But the journey, of course, is a very long one, because the contemporary art is based upon a history of enormous depth, with the rock art in particular, of extraordinary quality, going back tens of thousands of years. So there's been a bit of a disconnect between art on the one hand and real people on the other. And I think what's happening now is the real people are finding them, are demanding, where are we in this story? And that is where museums such as my own and Matt's are saying, we are a platform, use that platform, we'll work with you, and your story will take the place that it deserves to. But there's a hell of a lot of more work to be done on that.
Yes, I mean, the question that Alan asked is a good one. So how do you tell this story? And Patrick's, in a sense, encapsulated it. You start by asking Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples how they think the story should be told. And I think that's been the landmark change that's occurred in museums in Australia over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades particularly, and be given particularly impetus really in this century, in this new century. So that's, I think, very central to answering this question. The second about the need or not for a national narrative. I think that often our political masters, and indeed a good number of our public, imagine that they'd rather like a very singular national tale to bind us together. And I understand that, and I have got a lot of sympathy with people who would want the clarity of a singular tale about the nation. But I hope in what I said and what Patrick has said this afternoon, you would see that we both admit of a different kind of truth about the national community, and that is that it is necessarily plural in the societies in which we live today, and that if one's talking about national narrative, it's probably better to talk about them in the plural. That is, that there are a series of narratives that have a bite and hold upon the nation, in which we can rightly take some collective interest in, but we don't have to think entirely in each of those strands characterise us in our individual lives. Because the play of personal identity, collective identities, and the identity of nation is one that Patrick mentioned before, allows us both to be British or Australian at the same time, or in my case, with a family that came from Italy before the Second World War, allows me to feel Italian and Australian without those being necessarily exclusive conditions. And so if I think about that call of nation to me, I think that if the nation sustains an argument to me about its essentially plural nature and its acceptance of the differentiated communities in which we live, then I feel enlivened and encouraged to assert both my own individuality, my own sense of personal experience within a national frame. But anything other than that that is to try and be insistent about a very singular vision or version of our past, I think is where we are bound always to disappoint, because the idea of asserting a singular story requires you to get it absolutely right in everybody's mind, which is clearly an impossibility.
It also means leaving something out by creating a single narrative, even if it satisfies a majority point of view, means perhaps leaving out important minority views, which comes back to the First Peoples question that, let's say 100 years ago, if one was to have a National Museum of Australia, it would tell, of course, a very different type of story, I assume. So what I'm really asking is, do you have any advice for us? Because especially our national institutions struggle with, I think, the idea of telling multiple stories or engaging at least in questions and issues and debates. But it's a fraught process. Singapore now is only 50 years old. It stretches back 700 years. If we believe, if we appreciate that historical narrative. 60,000 we cannot yet claim, but perhaps that'll be revealed soon. How do we do all of that in a relatively new national context? Any advice?
I think one of the things is, well, I'll come on to that in a moment, just a reflection, which is, when the museum which I now run was established in 1854, it was established as the National Museum of Victoria. And indeed the gallery is still called the National Gallery of Victoria. And Victoria had its own navy, not a very big one, but it had its own navy. And did the museum then tell any story about Aboriginal Australia? No, it didn't. It didn't collect anything at that stage. So what goes to make a national story, and what a national story is in fact, is a very complicated matter. But one thing I should have said is congratulations on 50 years, because when a country is less old than I am, I think that's fantastically refreshing, because and here the world sees Singapore as a huge success story. And that's a pretty good beginning. Now, there are a lot of nuances about that, I know, but fundamentally, that is a pretty good starting point. And I think the opportunity to tell the various stories that interweave, again, use that metaphor, into what Singapore is now, it's a great opportunity to do it, because the question people will be asking now, the moment Singapore is 50 years old, in fact, I'm sure they're already asking it, is what next? Where do we go now? And we all know that you can't think about the future without knowing where you've come from. And that's and at 50 years, a moment in time, it's a wonderful opportunity for a community to look at itself, look at its ingredients, and say, these are the things that have made us good. These are the things that have been successful. These are the things we should like to lose. And where better to do that than in the cultural institutions?
I'm always very cautious about advice because I find myself being in need of it as much as having any grounds upon which I might give it. So, take that as a first point. Secondly, I'd say, this is hard stuff. If there's anything I hope you get from what we've said, this afternoon, and what I've said in the particular case of the National Museum, I want you to understand that it's been difficult. It's been hard. There've been arguments. People have disagreed vehemently about these things, and indeed, no doubt, some of the staff of the National Museum at various times have lost skin in the discussion. So the first point about it is that no one's getting this. There's no right answer. No one's getting this right in a way you wish you might be able to import and then make manifest in your own dealing with your own challenges. And, I think that what Patrick points to is right, is that this is obviously an extraordinarily successful nation in its first 50 years. And while you might not all agree all the time, and while you might still be searching for some of these answers about how to construct debates around these issues, so are we all, and having said that, trust in yourselves to work through those issues. If there's one thing that encourages me about the last 20 years in Australian life, when I consider how vehemently argued positions were in the history wars of, it's probably about 10 to 15 years ago now, is that, these are highly dynamic fields. And for all the challenge of that debate around 2001, 2 and 3, we're clearly in another kind of space now. And, when you're in the midst of contest and challenge and professional conflict, it can seem as if that might never end, but it does actually, and I think you're better for it. So I think that in our case, having had that debate more than a decade ago has helped Australia, because we're now in a different place than we were then. Have we sorted all this out? No, it will go on. I'm fascinated to see how people react to the exhibition at the end of the year, and I've spoken with Patrick about this, before, and the great challenge that it poses. But I do know that at the end of it all, I'll be convinced that it was worth doing, and it was worth taking on the challenge to do it. And so I'd encourage you all to trust in yourselves. I mean, you know Singapore better than anybody else. And within this room, and no doubt without it, in the resources of the broader community, lie all the resources you need, all the means you need to answer those questions in ways that will advance public debate in this country.
The other tension that I think you both address, especially in talking about your exhibitions and your projects, is a tension that we often face here, and that's this division between what I would call history, culture, and art. And we've actually historically created, along the British model, a division between fine arts, material culture, and history. And in various ways, those divisions and silos keep being reinforced. And yet, I see you address issues of First Peoples culture through contemporary practice, through powerful historical objects, but also powerful contemporary interventions, as you have as well, embracing the British Museum. Can you both comment a little bit about that? Because we represent, I think, in the audience, different types of institutions, and sometimes there seem to be unwritten boundaries about what a national historical museum might be, or a contemporary museum might be here in this building, and me maybe representing material Asian culture, although I'm not quite sure what that is.
Well, look, I'm not a fantastic one for boundaries, it has to be said, and I encourage, I guess, a more, if there are to be limits, and there are, I encourage a stronger sense of permeability of some of those, walls or divisions. I mean, of course, distinction in the marketplace for each of our institutions is important, and so we all have missions, some of them practically described in terms of the kinds of collections we hold, and some of them described in conceptual terms about the kinds of ideas across which we should range in our working lives. And I'm fine with that, because if every institution looked like the next one, I think we'd find that our public's quickly tired of us all. They want us to look different. They want us to have different modalities, different collections, different ways of speaking. Having said all of that, I do think that there has been much in my own experience as someone who was trained as an historian that I've learned from art practice, especially in the visual arts. Also in the performing arts, has to be said, but certainly in the visual arts, and in the curatorship of the visual arts. And I think that, especially as I've gotten older, an openness to those modes of working with collections in ways that characterise what in Australia we commonly speak of as galleries, as art galleries, has been, to my personal benefit professionally. So I think there is much to learn about looking at the practice of others in professional terms in these institutions, and clearly in the kinds of collections that we have in the National Museum that do range across a lot of the visual arts as well, and we're happy to collect those materials, even though we might present them in different terms from a very sort of conventional gallery presentation. I do think that is, has been important for us in extending the range of affect, because in the end, what we're trying to do in these places is not simply explain things to people cognitively, we're trying to affect them viscerally. We're trying to give them truths that they might feel as much as understand. And I think that there's many ways that we can open up our practice to different ways, to different means by which we might do that.
I love the opportunity to have it all. And the fact that there are many artists who want to work with us and we work with them, and those artists may be visual artists, or they may be musicians, they may be all sorts, and it's just thrilling to be able to do it. The guiding light being, each project we do has a very specified purpose and outcome, and if you got that, then you can build around it the right sort of relationships. So, for example, the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra have a thing called a pop-up concert idea. Not the whole orchestra, but just a few musicians. The other day turned up and did a pop-up concert in the Immigration Museum. The Fashion Festival is going to move up to Melbourne Museum. And we commission artwork, where commissioning artwork is the right way to address a particular topic or issue or what it happens to be. So I just love being able to do it. When it comes to collections, though, it's different. We know what we want, we collect, we know what the National Gallery collects. We almost never find ourselves in the sale room at the same time looking at the same object. We collect because of the association on the story that a particular object tells, whereas the gallery will approach it from pretty well, not entirely, but largely aesthetic or art historical approach. So it's a different approach, it's a different reason.
But you do collect Aboriginal paintings.
Absolutely, but we'll collect them with that sort of criteria.
So the two national institutions of Victoria collect Aboriginal art in that sense.
Yeah, we don't collect much. We leave it mainly to the gallery, but we've got a very good historic collection. But it largely wasn't collected as art per se, but as a reflection of the communities that created it.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we should hear from the audience some issues and questions from people who know better than I. Yeah, we've got 10-15 minutes. I'll call on people if I don't see.
I presume money talks. So in terms of funding, the funds come from the national coffers. And would there be any interference from the current ruling party and so on the national narrative and the kinds of subject matter you would emphasize or not emphasize, or how much a voice you would give to different narratives?
Good question. National first and then state. Answer for the US next.
Yes, you're right. Money does talk. Does it lead to any kind of circumscription of what we should do? Look, I think in almost all cases that's not the case. You know, I can say honestly, in the couple of years since I've been director of the National Museum, I haven't had anything but encouragement from the current government, and the previous government was much the same. Clearly, in the midst of the history wars that I'm describing, clearly there was a sense in which some of that seemed to become politicised, and people enter that debate in political life. But I tell you, even at that time, even at the most vociferous point in that debate, it wasn't actually people actively engaged in the practice of politics in the country who were the kind of the stellar opponents. it was people outside of that frame. Now, some of those people might have been able to draw upon a perception of political patronage to advance an argument or not. You can tell I'm choosing my words as carefully as any bureaucrat would when faced with such a question. But I think actually very often those things are about perception of influence, and the actual statement of interference or intervention is actually much less pronounced. It's not apparent. So that, I reckon, says something about us too, about our own capacity to think in the midst of such debates, to think about them in sensitive terms, and not always to make assumptions about what we think other people may think of a position, especially, in our sort of in political frames. And I say that over recent years, that I've often been caused to think about how my own personal assumptions or sense of how someone might react to an argument or a debate have been found to be wrong. Remember I said before I'm in need of advice? Well, my advice to myself is not to make easy assumptions about people's positions in debates, to wait for them to actually be explicit and announce them.
In the case of Victoria, we have a state government and we get our money. We get 2/3 of our money from the state government, and we raise the other third commercially and in other ways. And never, I have not experienced on any occasion any attempt by the government to influence us. It's the other way round. What we have been engaged in a very concerted advocacy campaign with the new government elected in November. We planned for it up to the election. We had a plan for one outcome and a plan for the other. And so what we do in our advocacy is take out those strands of what we do that meet what the government has said they want to achieve in particular areas. Now, there do tend to be a lot of commonality between those two sides of government. And we find ourselves in an area where there is bipartisan support for the museum. But to get the money, we have to put a case. And that case, I mentioned the one about mental health, for example. And there are many others like that where we have that opportunity. There's some new funds just appeared to do with endangered species. Well, that's an area which we work in very strongly, and we need more money to do it. So that's the way around. We read what is happening in the public sphere, and we don't change what we do to chop and change according to the wind. What we do is stress those aspects which are most relevant to that particular policy direction. And it's produced some pretty good results so far. But that's engaged. We've tried to get every significant minister through one or other of our museums, because there's nothing like seeing what you're doing for these assumptions. Everybody out there knows what museums do, what galleries do, but when they actually come in and see, I never knew you did that.
My final comment about that just occurred to me as Patrick was speaking is, this show with the British Museum, there's a lot of challenge in that, clearly, in the way I've described. I think all of you can understand the way that potentially will be a very provocative piece of work. Well, I've had nothing but fortifying support and certainty from the government of the day and encouragement for us to do that work.
And there's an international dimension to all of this, and the fact that the MOUs signed today with Singapore have been greeted with nothing but enthusiasm, as one would expect, but you would certainly hope for it. Creative Victoria, the ministry that I'm responsible to, delighted with it. The DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Victorian office, absolutely delighted with it, and I know on a national level, exactly the same. And I think that is something which is a strength to all of us, because I gather from conversations we already had today that cultural diplomacy has gone up the agenda here in Singapore too. Now, you can't do culture diplomacy without culture or people involved in culture. And the way in which we can open doors and open minds is like probably no other. So I think that's a really big opportunity for our colleagues here in Singapore, and it's an opportunity that I'm determined we make the most of, together with our other colleagues across Australia.
International partnerships are crucial for endorsement, for furthering our work, and we thank you both for helping us in that regard. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Bunwee.
Hi, I have a question about process, museology process. When you both of your presentations, you spoke about, both the exhibitions that you all were dealing with, they are dealing with a living community that has highly emotional sort of attachments to not just the subject matter, but the point. I think the sensitivity is always the point of view that is being espoused. So I wanted to ask you a question regarding, in approaching projects like that, from your sort of what you've done before, what is the sequence of the process like? For example, as curators and exhibition organizers, we always do our own research, and inevitably there is a point of view, and then you speak about going to the community, involving the community, but what happens, how much, in a sense, does that stage, when you actually deal with the living sort of inheritors, the people who have actual emotional stakes in the perspectives, how much does that figure in the willingness of the exhibition organizers to rethink their assumptions? I mean, have there been instances where it's categorically people are saying this is wrong, this is wrong, and what do you do in that kind of instance?
I could kick off with that one, and that is, for example, how we do our community exhibitions. Excuse me. Community exhibitions and festivals at the Immigration Museum. We, every year, call for expressions of interest from communities to who might wish to tell their story. Now, we then get approached, and then we select a particular, community to work with. It may be a group of communities clustered around a particular theme, and we've done that recently. For example, with we had a sweets exhibition, sweets in the sense of desserts, because every community has things to do with it, and you can bring out an awful lot with that. Now, when there's a response, then it's a case of sitting down with the representative and say, are you representative? Because you probably won't be, because there'll be other people in the community. Right, assembling a team of people and then saying, look, this isn't our exhibition, it's your exhibition. This is how we can go about it. This is what we do. We'll hold your hand through this process, but you need to do much of the work. And from that emerges an exhibition. We have one at the moment from the Scottish community. We did one with the German community, and that was very interesting because the German, you say about a German community, but actually it's people from Germany who may be members of all sorts of different organizations who may not have got together before. And we discovered that was the case. They hadn't got together again. They do now. That's because we got them together. But the perception of what they should be saying depended upon when those people had arrived in Australia. So you've got lots of young professional Germans who are for the German of today. And then you've got Germans whose culture was fossilized the moment they left Germany. And it was a completely different story and a different culture that they want to present. And these are the sort of things that have to be worked out in it, which makes it all the more fascinating, of course, when you discover these. But we aim for a legacy, and in that legacy, we had people talking together and collaborating in ways they'd never done before, and they still do.
So there's a lot in that question, actually, because of course there's different scales in terms of the complexity of projects and how much communities invest in them, and not obviously across all the work of, say, Museum Victoria, my own museum, National Museum. In the case of this British Museum exhibition that I was talking to, this joint project, so we've been actively working with communities on that since 2011, and that and actually had connections to those communities preceding that, but saying from the point where we said, we think we're going to do this work, we should try and do this work at the British Museum, what do you think? So it's early, start early. If you're really going to consult with people, don't turn up when you've done most of the show, obviously. Get in early and involve people in some of the real work, the real meat of this project. Without that, it seems to me that one is really being tokenistic about how one might be trying to stitch in a community. So from 2011, I think the other, be early. The other thing is people have to have some real stake in the game. I think, we understand, depending on the complexity of projects, that it is not absolute carte blanche. The museum has got limits and imposes some limits, and frequently wants to, Patrick was saying, hold the hands of communities, but it's going to say, look, I'm sorry, but we can't actually have work that's going to absolutely offend every person who walks through the door. So there are limits to this if we're honest about it, even when the best will in the world exists to engage productively with communities. And it seems to me you need to be really clear about those limits and be honest about giving some real power to the community voices with whom you're trying to engage. So that it can't be tokenistic, it has to be real. You have to listen to people, you have to involve them in your work, and at the same time you have to be honest about those bits that you're going to continue to own. And in that particular case, real power in the work existed all the way through, and then here we are in March earlier this year, and the curatorial staff have been working on it actively with the communities, 27 of these communities, visits across the country. It's cost millions to do this work in terms of the engagement. At a big workshop in Canberra, about 40 representatives of these different communities basically came to a point of saying, we don't like the way this is going to flow, you should change it. And you can imagine at this relatively late stage in this process how challenging that was, but it became important to make a change to show, because the change was sensible, point one, and point two, to really be honest with that process. It required us to say, yes, this is going to be very hard, but we need to accommodate your wishes with this, because it goes to the heart of what the meaning of the show will be. So, there's nothing simple about this in process terms, and I don't have a simple, how can I say it, outline of it. We tend to actually build that process with the basic principles established. We build that process depending on the scale and the kind of work that's involved. But start early, listen to people, build in real power for communities. And the other thing I think is that clarity of where you're going to call things to account or not extends to not expecting yourselves that because you've talked to 20 or 30 people in a community that somehow you've nailed all the community views, because no doubt there are going to be views far outside the group that you're speaking to, that you might want to be representative but can't be wholly representative for all the reasons we've already discussed about the fact that people's stories are their stories and they're quite particular.
One last question there in the back, by the camera.
Good afternoon. I'm June from the National Archives. I've kind of got a question for Patrick. The National Archives, my team, or rather my colleagues, are behind the World War II Gallery at Memories of War Factory. I don't know whether you know where that place is. It's basically where the British forces surrendered to Japanese occupation. So the storyline behind the exhibition gallery is really based on our archival materials and memories of survivors during the Japanese occupation. It's a very sensitive topic. And I understand that you guys did an exhibition in World War I. How do you go writing a narrative that it would not, obviously a topic like such it will tend to be quite biased as from who is visiting the exhibition. How do you go around writing an exhibition that is very sensitive in topic? There are a lot of red tapes that you have to experience because based on how we tend to do things over here, we are very cautious about what we can and what we can do, what sort of stories we can write. Like if I plan a program, sometimes I get comments by colleagues and say, oh, I think you better not think about going through that line because it's very sensitive. So I just like to find out how do you create or curate your stories on something like that. And the second question also is like why particularly the 8 memories of the 8 people, the subject matter for your exhibition, for the World War I exhibition, were there a reason behind why only the 8 that you're featuring in the exhibition? That's it, thank you.
Right, in answer to the first question, I really admire the fact that you are tackling this really, really difficult area. It's an important area, clearly, for Singapore, but it's a very important area too for all the other countries whose fates came together in this small part of Asia. There's a lot of horrible stuff there. And how you present that is I agree it's really challenging, and I would be reluctant to sit here and say, look, this is the way to do it, because I wouldn't even scratch the surface. At the end of the day, it's your judgment. But actually testing it on people to see to what extent there is an appetite to deal with the difficult material. One of the advantages you have as an archive is the testimony of people who actually experienced what happened at the time. And that is the one area where you can step back, where you don't have to say, look, this is my line, this is the way I'm going to do it. This is what people have said. It's part of the record at the time, the record. And with our gallery, our First World War exhibition, what made a tremendous difference for us was having a panel of experts, mainly from academic institutions, historians who had studied the First World War, had written about the First World War, who came together as a panel. And their advice to guide us down the difficult paths we were traveling was enormously helpful. And they also helped us to identify some of the 8, this is moving on to your second part of the question, some of the 8 people, well, all of the 8 people that we eventually decided to feature. Some of that happened, though, spontaneously, because I mentioned, and I didn't then explain it, but there were 2 German brothers on the German side who we feature in the exhibition. They both fought. One was killed. The other one was given the Iron Cross. The war finished. He went and lived in Berlin, I think it was. But then on Kristallnacht, the brown shirts broke in, smashed up the apartment because he happened to be Jewish, and destroyed the Iron Cross even. And he then left, and he settled in Melbourne, and married, brought up a family, and his grandson worked for the museum. So it's his grandson, so it's David demands a voice that you can hear as you go through the exhibition and discover that at the end. And so that was an exhibition which, in a sense, having established those sort of ground rules at the beginning, almost made itself because of these descendants who knew a lot about, knew more than we did about their family history, and were able to talk about it in that way. Another thing we did with that exhibition was, which you must come and see, by the way, you'd be very welcome. Everybody must come and see. Was to take a street in one of the suburbs of Melbourne and show what happened in every house. Now, some of the people left to fight or become nurses or whatever from some houses. Some houses nobody did, but they were obviously affected by their neighbours. And so digitally you can move along this street and you can see what it was like for each of these households during the war. And as we emphasised in that exhibition, what was the aftermath? What was the impact afterwards? And I don't know whether there's any parallels that might suggest themselves to you, but this is another good way of telling a story without being, if you like, a narrator in your face, but presenting the information in a way it's detached, but it's still very emotional. But in the case of our exhibition, it was impossible, and we didn't, we were prepared to be emotional. That was it. That was another decision we took. We were prepared to be emotional because war is emotional. And there are a lot of exhibitions about war which are not emotional. They're about, troops and machines, We have on display this packet, return to sender, and a little booty. And it's one of the combatants whose wife was pregnant when they left, and the baby was born, and she took two of the little booties, kept one, and put the other one in the envelope and said, bring this back so that we can both put them on the baby. And he didn't. And as you can tell, I feel emotional just telling you that story. So, which is probably where I should stop.
I think what Patrick said there has a very deep truth about it, about dealing with hard subjects in museums, and for the reasons that you can see, these are compelling stories that affect us all. If we're precise to the truth, if I can say, if we're precise about the historical record, especially when it attends to individuals, it's very hard for people ultimately to take exception to that. If the power of testimony of an individual who's caught up in events allows you to talk about events that in the abstract are heavily contested, then that's something I think that you can use, more broadly. There's no accident that the National Museum's exhibition on the First World War adopted a similar approach to the one that Patrick's describing and focused on precise narratives of people's experience of the war. It's no accident that when the history wars were raging about the effects of dispossession and destruction of Indigenous communities in Australia, our move was to actually go and be increasingly more precise about particular instances of violence on the Australian frontier that were unimpeachable. And I do think there's much in that for us when we've got challenging narratives to describe, is to look to the micro stories, look to the individual biographies that you can construct that are absolutely unimpeachable, because it's very hard for a critic to disavow the simple truth of an individual life.
Well put. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the two speakers. We should really conclude our session. You can ask further questions, but thank you very much, Patrick and Mathew, for sharing your thoughts and engaging in our questions and discussion points. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Wonderful job. Thank you, as always.
Sorry, may I take this moment to invite Alan Chong, Dr. Alan Chong, to present a token of appreciation to both Dr. Trinca and Dr. Greene.
Thanks for doing that.
Thank you, everyone, for attending our inaugural session of the Culture Academy's inaugural session of In Conversation With. There's a tea reception outside. I invite you to help yourself to some tea. Before you leave, I just want to make one note to thank our venue sponsors, Singapore Art Museum, without which this event would not have been possible. So thank you very much for your time.
I think it is, but I think it's about working collaboratively.
Okay, last one, just here, good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, last one, here. Thank you.
In a whole of centralized.
Yeah, I imagine.
It's not a surprise.
Oh, it's very interesting.